Well, welcome in. It's Now and Next, and this is something I don't normally do. Typically, we've got a music bed, and we jump in with all kinds of production or, kind of pump up the energy. This is what you might call the cold open on the show. And the reason I'm doing that is because everything that's been going on kind of has my head spinning. And I expect that there are many of you out there who feel the same. The number of people I've talked to who just look at me and say, I can't watch, I can't listen, I can't read any more about the news of the day. Whether it's the chaos that's going on in Washington, in Europe, in the Middle East, there's a real anxiety around that. And we are feeling the effects of that here in Canada because of the tariffs and so on. And at every turn, and maybe in the last 10 days, more than anything, it's funny how often I have said, I wonder what Christie Blatchford would be writing about. Where would her focus be? I wonder what she would have to say about that. And that was always the magic of Christie Blatchford, because you wanted to know what Christie was thinking. And she was always thinking. And it just so happens that I looked up and there's the calendar. And this past Wednesday, as we record this, a couple of days ago, marked 5 years since Christie Blatchford died. And I thought, where the hell did the time go? At one point, I'm thinking, so much has happened since that sad day in 2020. Just before the pandemic was declared, all of those things. But I hearkened back and I thought the number of times over the last 5 years where I've said, Blatchford would have had a field day with that. I mean, really, can you imagine the second term of Trump with Christie? What's going on with the politics in this country with Christie? What's going on with the Toronto Maple Leafs with Christie? I mean, there was a whole wide range of things. So I just didn't want to kind of have the time go by and not remark on that. Hers was an important and a strong voice and real context, and kind of taught me in many ways, it doesn't matter what you think as a journalist. It matters that you think. And she always put that front and center. So her commentary was always informed by the facts of the story. And among other things, I had the opportunity and the privilege to work on a show with her that was based on her Governor General award-winning book called 15 Days. And it was something of a journalist's memoir, if you will, of her experiences being embedded with Canadian troops in the Afghanistan war. We took that book and we turned it into a 1-hour documentary. And it was called Embedded in Kandahar, based, as I said, on the Governor General award-winning book. The documentary was an Edward R. Murrow Award winner. So, for the sake of those of you who, it'll be good to hear Christie again, bear with me. But here we go. I'm going to offer up the version of Embedded in Kandahar. I want to go back and say it was 2009, and it was broadcast the week of Remembrance Day on Newstalk 1010, CFRB. You'll hear Christie's voice, and you'll hear our friend David Bent in there, and you'll hear Christie's mind working as we talk about the process that she went through in covering that story and her experiences when she was embedded in Kandahar.
The day I landed in Kandahar, the temperature hit 60 degrees Celsius. The big thermometer outside the media tents at Kandahar Airfield hit that number, then stopped working. July saw the troops drinking a minimum 6 liters of bottled water a day, more often between 12 and 18. July was all combat. These were not the isolated skirmishes of peace stabilization missions, such as Canadians had performed in Bosnia, nor the one-off fight like the valiant men of the 2nd Battalion of the Patricias. This was new, or rather ancient, because it was war.
I'm David Bent. These are stories of bravery, friendship, life, and death from inside the new Canadian Army. These are stories of Canadian men and women who have fought and died in Afghanistan. These are their stories collected and chronicled by CFRB commentator and Globe and Mail columnist Christie Blatchford in her book, 15 Days. When we come back, the heat of the battle in the heat of July.
Embedded in Kandahar. This is a CFRB News special report. Here's David Bent.
It's early July 2006. Canadian forces in Afghanistan are preparing for Operation Zahar. The Canadians would move into Pashmul, some 30 kilometers west of Kandahar. As CFRB commentator, Globe and Mail columnist Christie Blatchford notes in her book 15 Days, it's one of the worst and most dangerous parts of the region, particularly in summer. Summer is the Taliban's preferred fighting season.
We were scheduled to leave for Pashmul around 10 p.m. on July 7th, 2006, and were to be gone for about 3 days. I can't remember if we left on time, though experience tells me otherwise. I remember taking a last look at the sky before getting into the lav. It was a typical starry Afghanistan night with a 3/4 moon.
The Canadians roll out of their base at the Kandahar airfield. It's pitch black. All vehicles are in blackout mode but for the ANA. The Afghan National Army needs lights. The ride is relatively uneventful for about 2.5 hours.
I was feeling pretty relaxed when suddenly we heard that call sign 1-2, Alpha's 2 platoon, was in contact. Since A Company was leading the way for the entire battle group, and it was only 12:30 a.m. on July 8th, this was hardly good news. Kevin Shamoon, the young captain commanding 1 platoon, remembers the moment vividly.
All hell broke loose. A huge gun battle ensued in which pretty much every vehicle in A Company had at least unleashed a few rounds. And the whole sky lit up, and we didn't really know what was going on, but we had a pretty clear idea of where the enemy was. And that was when I dismounted. My vehicles in my platoon were all in single file, facing towards the east, or pointing towards the east, and all of our cannons were facing south, so off the right-hand deck of the vehicles, pointing towards the objective area. 2 platoon was getting shot at, and we're returning fire. We didn't take any casualties. There was a couple close calls, but effectively pushed through that area and held the ground pretty tight after that.
But the firefight intensifies. In fact, so many Canadian vehicles are firing that Captain Shamoon says it sounds as if all of A Company is firing at the same target.
So I got on the radio and just called a check fire. I was like, 1 platoon, stop firing. Wait until we're actually fired at. Just hold your cannons. And then after that, I got out, and a couple of the other troops had gotten out of the vehicles just to watch the firefight. And I went up to one soldier in particular stood out in my mind. His name is Private Jody Salway. He was just, like, the adrenaline was just flowing through his veins. He was so happy. I remember him saying over and over that everything we had gone through up to that point was worth it all now. Like, this is why he joined the Army, and this is what he wanted to do. And they were actually, for the first time in their lives, in their adult careers, they were given the opportunity to do what they had trained for years and years on end. And this was the business. Bullets were actually going down range, and we were actually getting involved in the fight.
The fight involves the Princess Patricia's Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie companies. It rages off and on for hours. The fighting finally calms at around 4 a.m. It allows Christie Blatchford to follow Charlie Company's commander, Major Bill Fletcher, out of the lav as he assesses the aftermath.
The river was to our right, a mud path in the middle, and there, in a ditch by a little irrigation canal on the left, was a dead Talib. Impossibly skinny, looking 40-something, the way Afghan men half that age tend to look. Much of the back of his head had been blown off, and most of his clothes with it. One of the interpreters stepped away a bit and got down on his knees to pray. A few feet away was another man, seriously injured, unconscious, bleeding. He was treated by a Canadian medic and then choppered out. We returned to the lav, and though Fletcher, his lanky Sergeant Major Sean Stevens, and Corporal Keith Mooney soon went out again for most of the day, I stayed in the vehicle. I don't recall being particularly shocked or upset, yet I can see I wrote almost nothing in my notebook. I have absolutely no memory of the rest of that day. I just sat there, alone in the lav, too afraid to leave.
Embedded in Kandahar will continue. This is Newstalk 1010 CFRB in Toronto.
I'm David Bent. As she recalls in her book 15 Days, it's about the same time Christie Blatchford is seeing her first dead soldier in Afghanistan on July 8th of 2006 that Captain Kevin Shamoun is linking up with Alpha 1's platoon commander, Lieutenant Ben Richard. That's when Richard's platoon comes in contact with Taliban insurgents.
They were involved in some pretty intense compound-to-compound, house-to-house clearing and trying to root out a couple guys that had some machine guns and RPGs.
But the battle intensifies, and the decision is made to call in air support. The troops are told to withdraw to a safe distance. Captain Shamoun warns his men to get down. The inbound airstrike is merely seconds away.
We heard the jet doing a dive. We heard him getting louder and louder and louder. Dive bombing. Let the bomb go, and then the bomb went off extremely close to where I was. And I kind of got up, and I was just in shock. I didn't know what had just happened. And my warrant officer comes around the corner. He's covered in dust. His helmet was blown off. And he's pointing at my radio man, telling him to call it in. They got the wrong grid. They hit our platoon. So my radio man got on and said, 19er, it's 1-1. Wrong target. The bomb hit our platoon. Wait out for Kazovac. And I guess the guys in the vehicles that were back in the labs said the net just went silent. Everyone thought that the whole platoon had been wiped out.
Shamoun runs towards the bomb crater. The captain knows two of his men, Private Robert Adams and Section Commander Quinn Beggs, were both close to the impact site. He's calling out the names, asking if they're okay.
And then I walked up and kept yelling at my warrant officer. He got mad at me. He said, "No, they're not okay, Kevin. They're f***ing dead."
Shamoun reaches them. They're both on their knees. They've been deafened by the blast, but they are alive.
I stood Sergeant Beggs up. I looked at him. I checked his body, checked him over, and I looked at him. I'm like, "Quinn, you're okay, buddy. Everything's exactly where it's supposed to be." And we gave each other a big hug, and we just kind of laughed. We're like, "Man, that was f***ing wild."
Shards of shrapnel litter the crater. Remains of the 500-pound laser-guided bomb, some pieces are more than a foot long, are too hot to touch. Shamoun gets back on the radio. The captain happily reports no casualties.
Should have wiped out at least 6 to 8 guys from my platoon, but we remained untouched.
12 days later, a CanWest News report says the U.S. pilot who dropped that bomb mistook the Canadians for Taliban fighters. In fact, it wasn't a U.S. problem. Canadian military officials say any mistakes that day were made by the Canadian Joint Tactical Air Controller.
Embedded in Kandahar will continue. This is Newstalk 1010 CFRB in Toronto. embedded in Kandahar. This is a CFRB News special report. Here's David Bent.
On March 4th, 2006, Trevor Green was dad to 14-month-old baby Grace, and fiancé to Grace's mom, Debbie Lepore. That morning, Lepore was awakened by a knock at her door. It was sometime after 6 a.m. in Vancouver. She held her breath as she opened the door, greeted by 2 Canadian Forces officers, one of them a military padre. They were there to inform her that Captain Trevor Green had been viciously attacked and seriously injured. Green was a reservist with the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, assigned as a civilian military cooperation officer. Among his duties, it was his job to engage village elders trying to gain trust with the locals and to learn how the Canadians could be of help to the villagers. That may be compensation for damages done to homes or buildings, or helping with irrigation for the crops. On March 4th, 2006, Trevor Green is engaged in one such shura, seated on a blanket with 3 elders, and as a show of trust, Green has removed his helmet. Captain Kevin Shamoon sits about 6 feet away as Green engages the elders. His recollections are vivid, and you should be warned his description of the events that day are graphic.
So just as Trevor was talking, one of the guys came from, he was behind him, and you know how they have that sheet of cloth over their shoulders. They just kind of wear it like a cape or whatever. He had an axe under there, and he pulled it out and lifted it above his head. And I remember looking at him in the eye, big golf ball size, bloodshot eyes, and he just screamed out, "Allah Akbar." And then he just sunk the axe right into Trevor's head. And it was like going from 0 to 60 in half a second. And it was like my vocal cords just kind of flexed and some weird sound came out. I was just horrified. And I remember seeing Trevor, his eyes kind of rolling back. And then I remember looking down at my C8, my weapon, and picking it up and kind of stumbling backwards. I just pointed it at that guy and just fired 3 rounds. And before I was even on my feet, Sergeant Dolson, who's to my right, had already fired a couple shots. And one of the other troops, Private Matt McFadden, was also shooting at the same time, so he took 14 rounds in a matter of about 1.5 seconds, 2 seconds. And he just kind of flopped onto the ground, dropped the axe, and everybody just scattered. And then rockets started going off. I had no clue what was happening. I could barely breathe. I remember my chest was really, really tight, and my gut was just twisted. I just had a hard time breathing. I kept saying, "What the fuck? What the fuck?" I just said that over and over and over, just trying to make sense of what I had just seen. And I just quickly walked by Trevor, and his head was split open, and there was pieces of brain, like small pieces of brain matter on the ground. So I called over to the medic. He came running, and I basically just gave him a quick, "All right," he took an axe to the head, "Do what you can, he's right over there." So the medic's like, "Roger that." He went up and started treating Trevor. I was scared shitless, I'll be honest with you. I was so deathly afraid. Just because there was bullets flying around. Like, it's one thing to get into a gunfight, but it's another thing to have a gunfight initiated by seeing one of your friends take an axe in the head 6 feet in front of you.
In the face of his own fear and amid the chaos of a firefight, Captain Shamoon summons the presence of mind necessary to organize Trevor Green's evacuation from the village.
When we started moving Trevor, like we picked him up and put him on the stretcher, and when we started moving into the valley, all the movement really threw Trevor's body out of whack, and he started vomiting. And we need to get him onto the helicopter fast, because if he's choking, he's on his back, he could die. just from laying there. I had a guy on standby. As soon as he saw the helicopters, he was supposed to pop a smoke grenade, and that would mark the landing zone. But the first grenade didn't work, and the helicopters were getting closer, and then a second smoke grenade didn't work. So the helicopters were almost on top of us, and then finally the third one popped. But by that time, the helicopters had pretty much determined their own landing spot, and they went maybe 100 to 200 meters further away from us. So we had to pick up the stretcher and then run down the river valley like as fast as we could to get him onto the helicopter. And I remember the helicopters are extremely noisy. They're just really loud. You can't hear anything. We put Trevor onto the helicopter, onto the Black Hawk, and the Canadian stretchers don't fit on Black Hawks. And that's not exactly the time you want to find something like that out. So we put him on, and the door wouldn't close. I ran back to the Jeep to pass on the radio that he had been loaded up and they were just taking off. So I don't even know if they got the door closed or if they chopped the handles off or what they did, but I remember just feeling like, holy f***, like could anything else possibly go wrong?
Captain Green is successfully evacuated from the area. He survives the attack. Green is met by Debbie and his parents at a military hospital in Landstuhl, Germany, before returning home to Vancouver. He has since undergone several surgeries and physical rehab with the support of his family and friends.
Embedded in Kandahar will continue. This is Newstalk 1010 CFRB in Toronto. We now return to Embedded in Kandahar, a CFRB News special report. Here's David Bent.
Christie Blatchford has made several visits to Afghanistan, embedded in Kandahar 4 times between the spring of 2006 and the fall of 2007. Those visits are the basis of her book, 15 Days. During her visit in the summer of '06, Blatchford is struck by the differences she sees in the men and women of the 1st Battalion Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry.
I had last seen the soldiers in April. When I caught up with them just 3 months later, I barely recognized them. They were exhausted and skinny, and even if there were only a troubled few with a 1,000-yard stare, most of them obviously had been through the ringer. But while the long period of IED-wrought helplessness, the enemy as ghost, had them looking a little hunted, now they more resembled hunters.
Less than a month after Blatchford makes that observation, the Patricia's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Ian Hope, experiences what he calls the blackest day of his life. It's August 3rd, 2006, a day 4 perfect men were lost, he says, 7 others injured. He knows the day will be marked by acts of heroism, some witnessed, some described to him. In correspondence with Blatchford, Lieutenant Colonel Hope writes, "I will have to tell the story someday, when I can do so without choking up."
I saw Colonel Hope about a month ago in Comox, British Columbia, which makes it almost 2 years exactly, I guess, since he came back.
Christie Blatchford in conversation with CFRB's Dave Trafford.
All of this is still very much with him. I don't think he can still talk about it without choking up. I've never seen him be able to do it.
The impression I had when I read this book was that he was this giant, great figure who would come bounding over the hills and leading the men in combat and taking charge, and an incredible leader. And he was all of those things, except when I saw him, he's a small, wiry guy who
he's a punk.
Obviously took command and had real respect among his men and the women in that in those armed forces. It was incredible to see him, and I think it probably even underlined more the nature of his leadership skills.
Yeah, I think he led through the strength of his own personality and his own integrity and his own willingness to be on the front line as much as he could be. I mean, that's how good leaders in an army lead, and certainly that's how young Canadian officers lead, and it's how their bosses, when they're very good, lead as well.
What was their impression, those soldiers? What was their impression of Ian Hope?
I think they found him demanding and hard, but fair. I think they, at the time, I think since they've come back, they have realized how lucky they were, that they probably had the best commanding officer I think the Canadian Army has, actually, or certainly had at that time. Just a tremendous, honorable man, and courageous, and mostly, I think, fair. Those are not things that you realize when you're in the middle of battle. And, the Patricias had such a demanding rotation. Unlike every other battle group which has followed them, they weren't just in that narrow strip west of Kandahar city in the Arghandab River. They were all over southern Afghanistan. They were in Helmand province. They helped the Dutch get into place. They were up north, down south. I mean, they were all over. So they put tremendous miles, not just on their vehicles, but on their bodies. And I don't think at the time they would have been, the grunts would have been, they were too exhausted to understand, I think, how good their leader was, especially when, Hope would have to say, okay, you're down here 240 clicks from Kandahar city, and you've been out in the field for a month, and you were supposed to be going home today, but guess what? Now we've got to go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So those are hard things to appreciate until you're back home.
You go back to that day on the 3rd of August, and the whole scenario that played out around the schoolhouse and the number of men who were killed that day and the ferocity of that firefight. And it occurred to me when I got to the November 11th segment of the book that these were young men and women now who had come home, and in some form or fashion, November the 11th, because of days like that, would never be the same for them, because they were laying wreaths at memorials for their friends, or that if they weren't there, they knew that that's what was happening somewhere else in the country. It had changed them and that experience for them immeasurably.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, some of them came back feeling, realizing that they are now veterans themselves and feeling completely unworthy of the name, and, disbelieving that they, at the age of 30 or 31, or much younger, could be even mentioned in the same breath as the people who died in World War I and World War II. And some of them came back, I think, emotionally unprepared for what they were going to feel on November 11th. I mean, almost everybody in the battalion had some important November 11th ceremony that year when they got back. And I'm sure I know they've continued it. And, but these were very raw meetings with the mums and dads of their comrades who had been killed over there. They, drank beer in places from Newfoundland to Thunder Bay, I guess in Thunder Bay where Tony Benecca had lived, they drank his dad's homemade wine. And in Newfoundland, they drank beer. In other places, they were out west in Comox and Boomer Eichenboom's hometown. I mean, it was the hardest thing, I think, to have asked them to do, and nobody asked them to do it except they knew they had to do it. I don't know. It was as hard as battle, for them.
In the early hours of July 13, 2006, the Princess Patricias are in Helmand province. They're engaged in a fierce battle with Taliban insurgents as they attempt to set up a cordon around a suspected opium and IED-making compound. But the ferocity of that firefight isn't the story that Christie Blatchford chooses to focus on. She prefers a scene on the following day. The Patricias have arrested a motorcycle-riding Talib. The prisoner is blindfolded and made to sit in one of the ANA pickup trucks. But it's the confiscated motorbike that catches the attention of one Canadian, who in turn catches the attention of all the Canadians and Afghans present.
Lieutenant Colonel Ian Hope watched as a young brunette, a 21-year-old female gunner from A Battery, 1st Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, fired up the motorcycle and began riding the hell out of it. Soon Hope's RSM, Randy Northrup, said she pulled her long hair out of a ponytail and let it loose. Everyone was watching now, as the ANA looked on in amazement. A woman driving a motorbike. Hope had the ANA bring the Talib over to him and untie his blindfold. Then he pointed at Janie Duguay, with her hair flying out, in a T-shirt, free and tough, doing things on his bike that he couldn't do. That, Hope told the Talib, is the future of Afghanistan.
Christie Blatchford is the author of 15 Days, published in Canada by Doubleday Canada. She's also a Globe and Mail columnist and a commentator for Newstalk 1010 CFRB in Toronto. Embedded in Kandahar was written, produced, and edited by Dave Trafford, Christie Blatchford, and Jeff Moss. I'm David Bent.
This has been a CFRB News Special Report. Embedded in Kandahar is a production of Newstalk 1010 CFRB in Toronto, an Astral Media radio station.